I want to talk about the world's changing demographics today. Last year here at the seminar, I gave a speech titled The Great Replacement. I concluded in that speech that the Great Replacement is not a conspiracy theory, but over and done with. Canada has committed suicide. We are in the second to last scene of this half millennia long Canadian story. The story starts with rugged explorers arriving at the shores of what became Canada. The second to last act of the story, which is now underway, played out by a lot of my friends here, has descendants of those Europeans seeking refuge in gated communities. 90% of Canadian immigrants in 1970 came from Europe. 90% of immigrants today come from the third world, and it matters. Because you live in gated communities and your echo chamber, you want to avoid recognizing that North America will be an ethnically non-European majority country in less than 2 decades. Hilariously, Alberta, and I was at the seminar last week in Calgary, there was a discussion on secession. Hilariously, these people are still talking about secession and complaining about Ottawa when its cities like Calgary hardly look Canadian, let alone Albertan. North American political correctness has caricaturized your perception of reality. You ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room that Canada is no longer your country. My best guess is that the last act of this half-millennia-long play will be a civil war, not just in Canada, but across the Western world. This will happen when you recognize that you can no longer ignore the reality by barricading yourself with gold and silver in your gated community. This year, I will discuss the demographic changes happening in the world. Major shifts are underway that will irrevocably change humanity's nature. The results are already visible, but we might not appreciate the causality. As the populations of the third world countries continue to grow, ethnic Europeans who were 27% of the world's population in 1955 will diminish to a mere 6% by 2050. From 27% of the world's population, they will be a mere 6% of the world's population in less than a generation. They will also have lost all political power, as the West will have a third world majority. I'm going to quote numbers from Census Canada and the United Nations' homepage. Ethnic Europeans, through Dysgenics, now this is another factor that is playing out. Ethnic Europeans through Dysgenics will continue to fall in intelligence and other civilizational values. The third world, which has 2/3 of the world's population and continues to grow as a proportion of the world's population, is forever dependent on the West, particularly the USA. The third world, as a result, because the USA is going to go third world itself, the third world will go completely feral, savage, and barbaric, and fall into tribal units, the way they existed before Europeans started colonizing them. East Asia, which has avoided the naive belief that all races and people are the same, will be the only man standing. Let's start with normalizing our perception of the third world. As Rick said, you should start with a narrative. So let me start with a narrative about India and then about Africa. The religion of Buddhism was forgotten in India until the British discovered its remnants. Hardly anyone will believe that today. The Harappan civilization was completely forgotten. Indians had no clue about it. A history of hundreds of years, perhaps a millennia or more, had no records in India. And Indians think they have a huge, long civilizational history. Indian history was discovered through the writings of Italian, Chinese, Islamic, and other visitors. So the British connected the dots, took out elements from writings of outsiders to put together a vague Indian history. And then, of course, the British did a lot of archaeological work, one of the results of which was Harappan civilization. Some of the best preserved temples of Hinduism, and now Hinduism itself is a word concocted by the British to unify these varying pagan polytheistic religions. The best temples were discovered by the British. Why? Because these temples were lost to the forest. No one knew about these temples until the British discovered them. The British also deciphered the ancient forgotten scripts of India and translated the old scriptures that today's Indians are very proud of. Basically, India had no history until the arrival of Europeans. Now, it took me a very quick minute to understand what was happening, and my uncle, without irony, helped me understand why this happened. Looking down at old forts and ancient walls, he said they were rocks and unnecessarily occupied space. While the museums and sites that the British discovered are still there, they are all succumbing to the elements. Indians, including the so-called educated ones, did not have nor have any interest in history or in any of these historical things. Let's talk about Africa. Until the arrival of the British, sub-Saharan Africa was devoid of written languages. When Europeans tried to formalize their vocabulary, it fit into thin booklets. Why would you need words if you did not have any ideas to discuss? The concept of difference in degree, abstract knowledge, and subjunctive tense eludes the people of the third world. They, of course, have words to convey ideas today, but those words, most of those words, a vast majority of those words, were concocted during the European times. Sub-Saharan Africans lacked an understanding of organized farming and had little concepts of tools. Arabic did found some inroads in Sub-Saharan Africa, but strangely, Sub-Saharan Africans had failed to see the value of Arabic written language outside the mosque. A visit to the third world reminds you that much of it still has to discover the wheel. Similar to what I said about Arabic language, they really never discovered what to do with that language, and they still don't know the concept of the wheel. You will struggle to find a wheelbarrow in the third world even today. Women carry weight on their heads. They tend to forget wisdom and technology as soon as influences from outside civilizations, particularly European, are removed. Even when offered on a silver platter, they failed to imbibe values, knowledge, understanding, technology, and language. The English language in Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the third world has been reduced to pidgin. They have no value of grammar and they have no value for ideas. Now, except for a small minority of people in the third world who were what I call Christianized by missionaries and the colonial powers, the vast masses are not much different from what they were before the arrival of Europeans. Worse, they converted Christianity into voodoo. Remember, they converted English into pidgin. Most of what you consider to be good qualities of local people and religions, including Islam, are nothing but products of Christianization and Europeanization, what I called Christianized Brahmanism and Christianized Islam. With time, since the departure of Europeans, whatever values the third world had absorbed from Europeans have been eroding. The underpinning irrationality, magical thinking, and superstitious thinking, and a belief that the universe's working are arbitrary and their amorality have been overlaid by technology, so-called education, and sometimes even prosperity. The results have been perverse. Education and Western clothing have been adopted mostly from a cargo cult perspective. How many people understand the meaning of cargo cult here? Well, some of you. It's cargo cult. Cult. Okay. Most people don't understand it. It's an English term. Basically, what you do is that when it was either Second World War or the First World War, when Second World War, when Americans were dropping aid and flying over the islands in near Papua New Guinea, people there thought that if they started doing something similar, resources would fall from the sky. And that is called cargo cult mentality. You might want to search on YouTube cargo cult, and you will come across some very interesting videos. They started setting up airports, fake airports, thinking that resources would drop from the sky. God would send them resources. Something very similar has happened with education and Western clothing when it comes to the third world. They cannot think of education as a means to mentally grow and become better human beings. Education on an irrational mind that processes information through magical thinking is burdensome. They become worse, making such people worse than their uneducated counterparts. They can certainly be productive if they do back office work and copy and paste work, which is what the first world currently employs them for. But the quality of their work, either manual or office, is horrendous. They are rigid cogs. They don't understand the meaning and value of what they are doing. No wonder software written by them tends to bring planes down. Complex machines malfunction because micro compromises would have been made. And you cannot really trace back. You can do all kinds of official inquiries. You cannot isolate the small micro compromises that would have been made by these people. The third world cannot use prosperity either. It can neither love nor feel at peace. It makes garish and gaudy houses not for comfort, for it cannot understand the concept of comforts. They use their houses to show off. It loves using its money to have power over others. That's the only use they can understand for money. And at best, wealth is used for hedonistic purposes. neither financial nor intellectual capital accumulates in the third world. And this is 2/3 of the world's population, and I'm not including China in it. China is a second world country. However much you help them build institutions, systems, and civilizations, nothing is sustainable. They don't have inner resources to nourish themselves, leaving them forever dependent on the West. They tend to degrade through entropy, rapidly regressing to their pre-colonial past. Everything, basically, the third world touches, Christianity, education, prosperity, democracy, turns to dust. And you can do nothing about it. The underpinning culture of the third world hasn't changed. It has no future except to be a cesspool of tribalism. There was, ladies and gentlemen, no Wakanda in real life, and there neither will be one in the future. Despite evidence to the contrary, it is believed that immigrants from the third world assimilate over time. They don't. They actually become frustrated, isolated, and inward-looking as time passes. So while I have defined so far how bad the third world is, the people of the third world, once they come to the first world, actually become worse. And this has to happen. When they come to the West, they don't come here seeking liberty. For them, for an irrational, amoral mind, and I did not say immoral mind, I said amoral mind because irrational, superstitious people do not have morality to have immorality. They are amoral. They come to the West for economic reasons. They do not come here for liberty. Their hearts and minds are embroiled in whatever they left behind, usually and always actually the hellholes. When they come to the West to escape tyranny, and when you think they come to the West to escape tyranny and you have sympathy for the refugees, you project your own values on them. The tyranny in their homelands is a product of their thinking, and they feel at home in that tyranny. Without tyranny, they feel an existential crisis. Wherever they go, tyranny has a habit of emerging. Their hearts stay what they left behind. As they age, as they grow older, their sense of loss at not being where they should have been, where their hearts still are, makes their hatred for the West grow. Now let's come to the next generation, which is often believed assimilate better. Their next generation might speak English better, but they lose even that vague sense of gratitude that their parents had. Wherever they live in ghettos. And they must create the smells, including that of poop, noise and chaos that they left behind. And that's really a good symbol of how they bring the third world to the first world. They might be living in million-dollar houses, but the communities they create are noisy, chaotic, and smelly. Now let's come to the crux of demographics. In the past, what happened to the third world did not matter to Europe. Today, it does. In 1955, 75 years back, the African population represented 9% of the world's population, 9%. Today, with a fertility rate of 4, so an African woman has more than 4 children. Today, with a fertility rate of more than 4, they are 18% of the world's population. By 2050, according to the UN, they will be 26% of the world's population and will be well on their way to becoming half of the world's population by the end of the century. Africa will be half of the world's population by the end of this century. The civilized world, which is the West and East Asia, is losing its population rapidly. As I said, Europeans are going to be soon only 6% of the world's population from 27% in 1955. Now here is another issue. The only reason Africa seems not to be growing as fast as it actually is because the other third world hellholes are increasing in population as well. South Asia's population, which is primarily India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, will be comparable with that of Africa in 2050. They will have 26% of the world's population. But the absolute numbers actually give you a much better feel of what is happening. Africa's population represented only 250 million people in 1955. Just 250 million people. Today, it is 1.5 billion. They have grown 6 times in just 75 years. As I said, their fertility rate is more than 4. Now, what happens over the next generation is very easy to predict because it's a first-order issue. By 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people. So imagine 250 million people to 2.5 billion people in less than a century. That will have been a 10 times increase in Africa's population. This much is baked in the cake. You can do nothing about it. The reverse is happening in among Europeans who are behind virtually all inventions, who have had virtually all architects, philosophers, historians, anthropologists, explorers, etc. Europeans will have fallen from 21% of the world's population in 1955 to 9%. They have already fallen to 9% today and will have fallen to a mere 7% by 2050. And I'm talking about populations here, I'm not talking about ethnic Europeans. North America will have faced a similar fate. In 1955, they were 6% of the world's population, a vast majority of who were ethnic Europeans. In 2050, North Americans will be only 4% of the world's population, with less than 50% being ethnic Europeans. This is baked in the cake. In short, while ethnic Europeans were 27% of the world's population in 1955, they will have fallen to a mere 6% by 2050. The worst issue, however, is not just the fall of proportion. The worst is that the Europeans will no longer be the majority in Western countries. Canada, the United States, which is the spine of the West, and New Zealand will have ethnically non-European majority much before 2050. And Europe is not too far behind this game. The third world people, with their irrationality, immorality, and tribalism, will be in charge of the United States. Ethnic Europeans will have lost all political power. East Asian populations will have seen similar dramatic decline as ethnic Europeans, but they will retain their political power. Unlike the West, East Asian countries of Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and China have not sold their future by bringing in a massive number of immigrants. But while this is bad enough, there's worse. I'm very skeptical that the third world population growth will come down as the United Nations speculates. the United Nations expects. The United Nations expects African population to be close to the world's population by the end of this century, but they assume this based on a falling growth rate, not falling in population, but fall in growth rate. But here is a problem. Today, Africa adds 7 times more people to its population in absolute terms than it did in 1955. So it's adding more people today than it did in 1955. You will, of course, say, hey, but this is at a much larger base, so this will be higher. Yes, that's true. But even in percentage terms, Africa today adds 2.37% to its population every year, compared to 2.21% in 1955. So even in percentage terms, African population is increasing faster today than in 1955. So why is United Nations assuming that populations of African growth rate, not population, will start to fall? The belief is that, their belief is that once Nigeria, for example, achieves the economic growth similar to that of what South Korea had at one point of time, its fertility rate will start matching that of South Korea. Now, this modeling of population growth is done by United Nations bureaucrats who, at least in public life, because they stay in gated communities at the end of the day, but they, in their public lives, believe that all races, all religions, and all people are the same. Of course, I don't see it that way, otherwise nothing I have said or I will say will make any sense. But while the third world populations continue to increase, there's something similar happening among ethnic Europeans, and particularly ethnic Europeans. The proportion of intelligent people continues to fall among ethnic Europeans. Why? Because every European country has encouraged intelligent people to have fewer children, while they continue to and they do it through propaganda, through taxes, through welfare policies, while they continue to encourage less intelligent people to have more children by offering them welfare money. As the proportion of much smaller intelligent people continues to fall and becomes insignificant. So remember, a big chunk of the fall in population has been happening or population growth rate has been falling because intelligent people have been losing numbers very rapidly. But they are now increasingly insignificant in populations. And when that has been achieved, the never-reducing population growth of the less intelligent people will kick in. And my guess is population growth will restart again. And as I said, population growth is actually already faster in Africa than it was in 1955. Now, we thought that democracy would take care of our political problems. We thought that Darwinism no longer mattered. We could, through technology, take care of everything. We thought Thomas Malthus was wrong. We made fun of the limits to growth, and including a lot of people here, I guess. We thought that our economies would continue growing and our ingenuity would handle all problems. We fooled ourselves into believing that human beings were always an asset, thinking that a calf, when it is born, is an asset, so should a human child be. Julian Simon. The problem is you can cut a calf into meat. You can't do the same with human beings. Worst of all, which is the dogma in the West today, they thought that all human beings were malleable and that race and culture did not matter. Now, let me, based on what I have said, the narrative I have given about the third world and the numbers I have given, let me draw my conclusions from what this means to me. I'm going to come to very similar conclusions to what Jonathan Roth made earlier, but I base my conclusion on a different factor. I'm going to divide my conclusions into three parts: the Western society, the Third World, and East Asia. And contrary to what I said, I will also talk about why, contrary to what I have said about Africa and the rest of the Third World, there is actually a population collapse coming in the Third World. Because there's another very high order factor that is kicking in the Third World. But let's talk about the West first. And let's talk about the USA, which is the spine that holds the West together. While the US's ethnic European population tends to be more on the right, ethnic non-Europeans vote predominantly for the left. The result is that since the 1988 election of George H.W. Bush, the popular vote has consistently, since 1988, gone to the Democratic Party, the only exception being the wartime President George W. Bush's election, second-time election. This happened even though the Republican Party today is far more leftist than the Democratic Party was in the 1980s. Eventually, in the United States, and of course it has already been happening since 1988, but with a couple of exceptions. The couple of exceptions were that electoral college trumped popular vote in case of Donald Trump and George W. Bush's first election. But once a couple of election cycles are over, the popular vote will trump electoral college, and there's no hope for the right-wing people to win elections again in the United States. Let's look at some of the numbers of the United States, because at the end of the day, it is the spine of the West. More than 43% of US population is of non-European ethnicity. So close to 1 out of 2 people are already of non-European ethnicity in the United States. This is from the Census Bureau 2020 report. It's on their front page. 50% of US children under the age of 18 are members of ethnic minorities, which means that even if you close the border with Mexico completely, stopped accepting all refugees, all immigrants, all H-1B1 visas, America will be an ethnically European, it will have ethnic European minority within 10 to 15 years. It will no longer be a Western country. Now, of course, we don't have to wait for the majority mark. As I said, things have been changing in the US since 1988 because the third world population pressures are shifting it increasingly leftist. The US is already not run as much on Western values anymore. As time goes by and as the third world majority voting kicks in completely, decision-making will increasingly reflect magical thinking, irrationality, and amorality. What will happen at that point of time? A civil war will break out when people of European ethnicity wake up from the slumber of their political correctness and recognize that people are not the same and changing them is impossible. The same fate awaits other Western nations. The US is the first to go, but if the spine goes, you can imagine what will happen to the rest of the West. Canada and New Zealand are also going to be ethnically non-European in less than 2 decades. Effectively, ladies and gentlemen, the West has committed harakiri. It has committed suicide and devoted itself to a several generation long civil war and mass scale culling. Now, when European populations, let's talk about the third world now. When European populations were more than a quarter of the world's population in 1950s, there was Pax Britannica, and later Pax Americana came into existence. Today, with a population of only 14% of the world's, the US is trotting towards becoming an ethnically non-European country in a decade or less. So, as this continues to happen, we will see the ramifications on the third world. Now, what happened in the past? US administrations managed to keep Latin America from going too far to the left. They tried to, not the right way always, and I don't agree that they did the right things, but they tried to stop Latin America from going left. But what can you do today? American administration is still already leftist and increasingly woke. And the result is for you to see, Latin America is rapidly going leftist. And as a result, the rest of the third world countries is the same thing happening. America is able to apply less and less pressure to keep those people sane. Now, many people think that it's democracies of the third world which kept them relatively sane. That's completely wrong. It was the whip of the United States that kept the leaders of the third world relatively sane. But now that the US is becoming weaker, the third world leaders are not only doing what they wanted to always do, they are even meddling in the affairs of Western countries. India's Prime Minister Modi, who was at one point of time banned from entering the United States, was allegedly behind a murder in Canada. And he apparently attempted a murder in the United States. So the third world leaders are coming out of the woodworks. The third world, unhinged from any control or directions, particularly of the US, is reverting to its pre-colonial dark ages. They failed to industrialize. India is actually deindustrializing, and millions are moving, tens of millions are moving to rural places. Contrary to what the media tells you, the third world has been economically stagnant for the last decade or more. Now, third world today has populations 20 times as they had before Europeans started colonizing them. So 19 people out of 20 in just simple math of the third world owe their lives and owe their existence to European technology, European medicine, and more importantly, the European rule of law, which enabled large concentrations of people to exist together in third world urban areas. And a more recent impetus has been the Green Revolution. And we thought Thomas Malthus was wrong as a result of it. But this was probably the last thing that could save these people. The problem is we have very likely reached the limits of agricultural growth in the third world. They have done over-farming, water tables are sinking, and they have faced unimaginable pollution that you can only understand once you have visited the third world countries. The third world countries basically has nullified the benefits they got from the West. I would not be surprised as a result of it because they have nullified all benefits that their 90 to 95% of their populations get lost eventually in famine and war because the US is no longer there to apply the whip to keep those people civilized and relatively sane. Eventually, the third world across the board will fall apart into tribal units. When I start seeing Taliban kind of institutions start emerging in the rest of the third world outside Afghanistan, I will start to have confidence that some kind of stability will return to the third world. The third world is destined to have Taliban kind of systems. That leaves me with one hope, and that's the East Asia. These are Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and China, assuming they don't give in to the pressures from Western political and media establishments who are woke and increasingly without any contact with Western values. And I hope East Asia stays homogeneous. Now, once China emerges, will there be anything like Pax Sinica? Sinica refers to China. The issue is China, from what I understand, has no interest in getting involved in affairs of other people. They only want to trade and do business with other countries. And they probably don't even have the competencies that the British and Americans have had. My guess is that East Asians will be the only people who retain their honor culture, who will have refused the political correctness of the West, and will have escaped the death trap. So, in conclusion, starting with the United States, in just over a decade, the West will start becoming ethnically non-European majority. But the spine is what that matters, which is the USA. The third world will continue to fall apart without the whip of the United States. They will go insane, they will go tribal, and they will fall apart, and they will get lost in famine and war. And the US will no longer be able to stop them. And it will not even have an interest to stop them because the United States will increasingly look like a third world country. The only hope I have is from East Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Oh, well, I'm hearing different things. I mean, there are pockets, like even I have a biblical worldview, so, I listen to a lot of the missionaries from all the different countries that come and speak. But I just don't kind of see when I see a lot of, uneducated people, well, for some reason, they're much more open to the gospel. And I hear that there's a lot of, I wouldn't say even conversion, but just supernatural encounters that they're having. I don't think God's going to give up on America. I believe I was born for such a time as this. Like there's one, we have to understand that there is that other, two sides to. I can see that, like in the Bible, it's all about seed time and harvest. Well, there's the tares, and you can keep looking at the tares, and we have to look, know your enemy, but there's a harvest happening as well, and innovation, and we haven't even been, when you think about the technology, like you just have to study the pyramids in Egypt. We haven't even been able to duplicate all those, but those technologies, I'm not sort of for AI and technology, but there are so many things that we still don't truly grasp and understand. And spiritually, I think we haven't even reached our fulfillment. So I just saying that there is, two sides to looking at things. You can look at the tares, and we have to look at the tares, but there's the harvest as well that's coming up. So who knows how this is going to play out.
Okay. Have you traveled in any of the third world countries? Have you stayed any meaningful time there?
Like, I don't understand, like third world, are you saying there's first I'm not quite sure
Okay,
what you
I
mean by
define the
third
first
world.
Okay, first world is very simple. The Western countries, the European countries, and East Asia. And I might include China in that because it continues to improve in my view. The rest is all third world, which is Africa, Latin America, the Indian subcontinent, which comprises of 2/3 of the world's population.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, have you actually spent a meaningful time without your US dollar, meaningful time in the way that you are actually living there and you have worked with those people?
No, I haven't. No,
Okay,
I haven't.
so
But look-
Christianity in Africa is voodoo. So you might
Yes.
think that these are becoming very Christian countries, and the
No, I
first-
didn't say that they're
Okay.
not Christian countries yet or whatever. I'm just saying that there are people that are working in those countries. They come back and they tell us things that are happening, but they're not pessimistic. You know, they're very hopeful. And look at Israel. They went into a country that was, Mark Twain said, it was just a barren desert. And look what happened. They turned it into a very productive
Yeah, but
place.
you're talking about-
What I'm saying is that we haven't tapped into our potential, our full potential. And I believe the harvest is coming.
Yeah, but your belief is could be superstitious.
Well, I don't believe it's superstition, but I just wanted to,
Yeah,
I
sure.
know
Yeah,
you will
thanks.
think that, and
Thanks.
I don't believe
Yeah,
that. And
thanks.
I know that, I'm only talking, okay, I don't know how it's going to play out in the, I do know in the Bible, biblical, because I say I have a biblical worldview, but I think there's a lot of hope going forward
Well, again,
right
as I
now.
say, positivity and hope can be very
Not
superstitious.
just, I don't believe that it's superstition or it's, you know, this is what I say. We have a lot more human potential that we have not tapped
Okay.
into, and we need to really, that's why I say you can look at the tares or you can look at the harvest and the wheat. That's all.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay. Well, you started with some demographic predictions based on UN modeling, and you ended up with disease, famine, and war. And I kind of tend towards the latter. I mean, exponential growth always comes up against boundaries. And I think that population, I don't put a whole lot of faith in UN modeling in any of its forms. So I think that the African population will tend, we take the example of Zimbabwe, which had a couple of 100,000 people when the Brits showed up, and it grew to millions based upon European agriculture. They drove it out, the population goes down, they try to lure the farmers back. But ultimately, these exponential growth models do have their limits, huh? Now, all Europeans are not the same. We might look the same, but we're not, you know. Eastern Europe avoided the mania of, you know, the Western idiocy because they were isolated somewhat during the Cold War period, right? So my question would be, what are the prospects for Eastern European countries, possibly including Russia, under the scenarios that you've put forward?
Okay, so as I said, ethnic Europeans were 27% of the world's population in 1955. That included East Europeans. They will be only about 6% of the world's population by 2050, in another 25 years. So they will be a small fraction of the world's population. That includes East Asians. It doesn't matter even if they took over the mantle of Western values eventually, but I don't see that happening. But you can argue about it, but they are such a small proportion of much smaller proportion of Western populations that I don't see how they can take over the mantle of the world's leadership. So if you are talking in terms of Russia taking over Pax Americana, I don't see it that way. I don't see how that will come about.
Well, we do see the only kind of resistance to this mania in countries like Poland, like Hungary, you know, maybe Romania. So there is that sort of an aspect of white European culture.
Yeah, but I think they are resisting that more out of a plain, I wouldn't be wrong if I said that they are resisting not because they understand the values of what the non-values of West Third World means. They might be doing it just because they are more bigoted. They just don't like foreigners. That's not what I want. I want people not to be accepted because they don't have the right values. So I don't see that underpinning of philosophical values emerging in East Asia, or at least not enough to take over the mantle of the world affairs. Russia has completely failed to, it only uses Pax Russiana, whatever you call it, for its self-serving purposes, as it did in the past. I'm not saying America has been any innocent, but I don't have any hopes from East Asia, East Europe from that perspective.
Okay.
I didn't really have anything.
Thanks. I'd like to add to your explanation of the poverty, say, in Africa, two things that African students told me in the US. They said part of the poverty was created by the West sending clothes to Africa and destroying the clothing industry, and sending food to Africa and destroying the farmers' work and things like that. So sometimes, if that's true, that doing good, you don't see the long-term consequences.
How many people, how many Japanese or Germans have you met, Lilia, who complain about what America did to Germany or Japan or Japanese Americans during the Second World War? Probably none. Africans have no honor culture, so they always find a reason to blame someone else for their problems. So what you said actually exhibits their absence of honor culture. That's all I can say, and that's why there's no hope, because the foundations are simply not there. The civilizational foundations have not been built in Africa. Christian missionaries worked for hundreds of years in Africa, but have made only a minor dent in African culture, and it's all reverting back to its pre-colonial days. So, and whatever Christianity you see in Africa or in the Indian subcontinent or even in Latin America is increasingly voodoo. You just have to pay closer attention to what's happening there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, this topic, but I got to go, but thanks very much, Jayant.
Thank you, Louis.
Just a thought. I've had some experience working with illegal immigrants, and if work ethic is an example of Western values, I've seen a fair amount of illegal immigrants adopting a good work ethic over time. I don't know what that means, but I don't know how relevant it is towards what you said about illegal immigrants coming to the United States, but I do see that personally.
Yeah, better than nothing. Better than nothing, but they don't necessarily add to the civilizational values.
Did you have a question?
Hi, remarkable. It's impressive, your presentation again. Last year was also very good, but this year I have just one disagreement with you on the part that you said that Latin America is turning into leftism because of the lack of US interference, and at least in the case of Brazil, I can tell you that it didn't decay to this communist dictatorship that we are now because of the lack of the US interference. On the contrary, it was the CIA who made this plot and this coup d'etat in Brazil, and they selected the current dictators, because the Supreme Court is also a dictatorship there. But so this is proven. There's news on the mainstream channels saying that the chief of the CIA went to Brazil to pressure ex-president to not doubt the election results, which was clearly stolen. So U.S. is to blame for most of the leftists and rightists and everything. CIA will not leave the control of those countries. It's too powerful, too much powerful.
Well, so my response is that I'm not going to claim I understand Brazil too well, but dictators are the only people who work well for the third world. The local populations elect horrible demagogues. So you were much better with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. You are very likely much better with Taliban in Afghanistan. Pinochet in Chile was probably a much better person to be in power than Allende. Not that he was a saint, but U.S. when it has imposed dictatorship, and they have been very erroneous in how they have done everything. But democracy in these countries is a complete disaster. And that is why they don't want to interfere in what's happening in Saudi Arabia. They want to keep Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, UAE the way they are dictatorially, because they are run so much better without democracy. Yes, sir.
If you're so kind, I cannot help myself. Idea is excellent speech. I am absolutely happy about percentage, but sorry about numbers. I believe all your data and numbers calculated from official statistics.
Yeah.
I absolutely don't believe this official statistics. As Kenneth said, they lied us everything. First of all, I believe you believe that Chinese in China 1.5 billion people. According my estimation, it's supposed to be less than 500 million. And technically some Chinese people, scientists talking about this. In Russia, for example, officially they're telling 145 something million people, but people from actually was working with statistics and so on, no matter that it was prohibited, published numbers 80 million people. All scientists that calculate population by food consumption in different countries estimate that actually population everywhere is supposed to be 2 times less than official numbers. I'm not talking about Canada. I believe the same situation. And officially, some seconds, you know that statistic actually prohibited. It's criminal offense if somebody without government permission making statistical research. I believe you should not waste your time. In Soviet time, it was officially written everywhere. In Russia now, it's written everywhere. In Canada, it's written everywhere. Nobody has right to make a statistic.
Right. So
it means, if you need explanation and can continue, we should check everything. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is that the proportion of ethnic Europeans and East Asians is even lower than what I said in my talk, which makes the situation even worse than what I said.
Proportion, maybe.
Yeah, proportion is what matters.
Population in America, Canada, and other countries, extremely.
Yeah.
But because all numbers incorrect, we should start everything from the beginning.
All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, over the last 40 years, I've done
Can you switch on the microphone?
there we go. Yeah, I was going to say, over the last 40 years, I've done more than 1,000 flights to 91 countries, and I've seen some really do well, like Central Europe coming back online. East Asia is just spectacular. But I've also watched countries like South Africa slowly degenerating into bush. But what I'm kind of curious about is what percentage of the third world do you think is reliant on food aid from the advanced countries? So if they go into economic chaos and the aid flows stop, what happens to the population there?
I don't have an answer to that. It does not even matter because even if, let's talk about India because I know the numbers better. They actually are a food grains exporting country. But the problem is that 40% of Indian children are stunted because they don't get proper food. So yes, India exports food, but so what? It can't even feed its own people because they can't afford to buy food. So it's, I think, a very complicated situation there. But remember, 40% stunted people is a horrible thing for the future of the world.
Jayant, I enjoyed your talk. I lived and worked in Africa for a few summers in a row about 15 years ago. And the disparity between Africa and the West is just astounding. And I was wondering, what is the commonality to their lack of success, to their failure? And something that I learned about the Black African is that they live in what I call the eternal present, like an animal.
Yeah.
If you offer them, I'll give you a Coke now, or I'll give you 2 Cokes tomorrow, they'll take the one right now. There is no delay of gratification, there is no long-term time horizon, and both of those things are the basis of civilization. And if you don't have those 2 components, you have nothing to build on or from.
Yeah, so this is something I have seen across the third world. There's no future orientation. There's no concept of reason, because the concept of reason comes only when you have a future orientation. You are trying to process abstract knowledge. They don't have a moral system. They are not immoral, they just don't have a moral system. There is a very interesting clip has been circulating for a while. This guy goes to somewhere in Africa and asks that person, do you feel bad when you rape a woman? And this guy says, yeah, I feel really bad about that I raped women. And he says, yeah, so it goes on for a while. But then this interviewer finally asks, what is it about it that you feel so bad? And he said that I feel bad because I might have caught some disease from her. So they have no empathy. When they kill someone, they kill people very slowly. What they put tire on their heads, put petrol in the tire, and give a matchstick to that person to make sure that he lights his own tire. They want you to die slowly, and this is like being early teens who enjoy the suffering of other people because they don't have any empathy. And this is something that you see across. There's no honor system. There's no integrity. There's no honesty. So if I entered into contracts in India, out of 100 contracts, 1 might get honored. I have never had a contract that got honored. In the West, 99 will get honored, even if it's a verbal contract. So that's the difference between these people. They don't have any honor culture. They don't have any morality. They are irrational people. And as a result, it's their base instincts that completely control them. It's their desire for sex, money, and power that is completely and always in control of these people, and that drives them moment to moment. IQ is one key aspect of it. The third world countries suffer from a fixed low IQ, and all approaches have failed to elevate those IQs.
Jayant, I'm just not buying this.
Sure.
I wish you were a lot more optimistic about the world. I've heard you give this talk a couple times now, and each time the world's richer. The GDP growth rate of India this year is more than 6%. Keep climbing?
8.4% actually.
Okay. Now, I have a completely different life experience. My parents moved to Taiwan in 1958, when Taiwan was one of the poorest countries in the world. As Albert said yesterday, it was a dictatorship. And was there trust? Not much. And look at Taiwan today. It's a completely different country, one of the best countries in the world. I don't understand why that can occur in other places. I don't think there's anything completely special about Taiwan.
There is. So the thing is that every country was offered technology and wisdom on a silver platter. Some people absorbed that wisdom, many did not. Look at it two ways. Out of 200 countries on the planet, the only civilizations are either ethnically European majority countries or East Asian majority countries. There's no other civilization. Africans have never created a civilization. Indian subcontinent people have never created a civilization. To the limit, Argentina and Uruguay, our civilizations are because of people of European ethnicities. There are three exceptions to what I said. One is North Korea, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And I think these are the three third world countries that have a very strong reason to become first world countries eventually because of the ethnic stock they come from. But they are a minuscule proportion of the world's population, so it did not really demand a mention in my talk.
When do you think this European thing started? Because go back a couple hundred years, Europeans were killing each other like crazy.
Yeah.
This amorality you're talking about, I think you'd find it in Europe too. I'm sorry, I can't see this as anything that's Europe-centric.
Yeah, but the issue is that when wisdom came, Europeans accepted it. When wisdom wasn't there, it just wasn't there anyway. The problem is that that wisdom has been given to third world countries. I mean, Christian missionaries have done a humongous job in these countries. The whole educational system of the third world has been set up by Christian missionaries. However, they have made only a very limited impact. So what I'm saying is that those people who could absorb the moral values, who could absorb the wisdom, did. Other people are just resilient. They just can't absorb it. It just doesn't stick in their minds. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.